So the truth of the legend does not so much lie in the fact of history, but more lies in the fact that there is a connecting logic to it. And in this context, it is important to talk about positionality because the people who are quote unquote owning the legend will certainly connect to it more strongly than the people who are just reading it from the outside. And in this context, when Bachofen or even Grimm were pointing out to the differences between legend and myth, they were also kind of emphasizing the fact that there is a meaning for their own people to be found in these legends, that they were not just valuable for their own sake, but they were valuable for the larger sake of mankind. So here, we're going to read today a series of article published in about the same year when the more general discipline of folklore started to focus a lot more specifically on legend, kind of remedying the things that were mentioned yesterday in yesterday's lecture. So here from Dorson, we have in general usage, the word legend implies an exaggerated and colorful account of an event. Legend, in this sense, differs from historical facts and is indeed disdained by historians. The folklorist attaches a more specific meaning to legend and regards legends with keen interest, for they form one of the staple categories of his subject. To him, a legend is a traditional oral narrative regarded as true by its teller and by many members of the society in which it circulates, but containing remarkable or supernatural events that follow a pattern. So the pattern is obviously important because we can recognize the pattern culturally, but also because it is a local story, or perhaps, if you will, a local truth. The legend gets a lot of its relationship to the fact that it can be shared with others. And so whether or not you understand that people have heard of it, that people have had the story told to them before, you can still make sense out of the fact that you recognize those elements in it. And so perhaps the details would change, perhaps the places will change. Could be that the names of the people might change, but they will still be recognizable. And this is a pretty important part of how the collective story is concerned here, because people will be able to recognize the things that are important to them in particular and kind of reconsider the things that are a little bit less important to themselves. So legends are known locally and are experienced locally as well. Legends deal with persons, places, and events. Because they purport to be historical and factual, they must be associated in the mind of the community with some known individual, geographical landmark, or particular episode. Many or all of the members of a given social group will have heard of the tradition and can recall it in brief or elaborate form. This is indeed one of the main tests of a legend, that it be known to a number of people united by their area of residence or occupation or nationality or faith. These groups keep alive and pass along legends of heroes and bad men, of local visitations from demons and goblins, and of miraculous interpositions in battles and plagues. Printed sources such as town histories and newspaper feature articles often reinforce this spoken tradition. And so Dorson looks at three different types of legends and how those different legends might consider to have different meanings to the different people that are involved here. But it is important that he emphasizes first the fact that those people have a pre-existing shared knowledge or pre-existing shared understanding. And once you establish that common terrain in your memory, then all of the details might come into play more or less intensively. And as he mentions as well, they might be more or less scanned details or more or less elaborate. And perhaps if you already know some of the parts, knowing more details makes the story more useful, more meaningful. Conversely, if you already know the story in a more elaborate form, you might be more interested in being told just for your edification, just for the fun of listening to a story you already know, kind of watching a movie that you've already seen many times, or listening to a story from your parent or grandparent or something of the sort. This is how you will create a series of memories that are kind of embedded in this group of people. Again, family, nationality, residence, occupation, faith, whatever. And those people will carry on the tradition with them. So, because they are regarded as true, because they are known to some locale, it becomes a very different matter of legend once you have a very high diversification of people. In the context of Christianity, as we were told on during the last lecture, the idea of people sharing the basics of Christianity is obviously a way in which they will be more intently attached to the stories of the saints, because they will have that daily interaction with the church, daily interaction with prayer. And so this will be the most meaningful ways in which they relate to one another. But once you extend that conversation to people of different faiths, of different local origins, of different occupation, or even different areas of residence, the legend becomes a very different matter. And during the 1960s, there is a acknowledgement of a completely different kind of legend, one that Dorson identifies in this particular conversation, the urban legend. A number of legends of supposedly actual happenings circulate in modern society. In fact, the coming of the automobile has given legend new wings. Ubiquitous urban legends deal with the ghostly hitchhiker, the maiden given a ride by a passing motorist who finds her gone when they reach her destination and learns from a photograph that she had died some years before. The stolen grandmother who died while traveling with her daughter and her son-in-law, and whose corpse, strapped to the roof of their car, vanished while they were in a restaurant. And the death car, offered for sale at $50 because of the death smell of its former owner, who had committed suicide or had been accidentally killed inside it, could not be removed. In spite of the factual reports of these cases, no one has personally seen the hitchhiking damsel or the deceased grandmother or the ill-smelling car. The stories are told at secondhand. And this is a new form of legend that starts to appear once you get into an urban setting where you have a high diversity of people that are connected with one another. And certainly, this is something that was identified early on by these folklorists, because there were immigrant workers going from one place to the other. And once they got to that new place, they started to create new legends as they experienced them, partly based on their own knowledge, of course. So they might take some of their own previously existing legends and turning them into the new intellectual terrain that they are meeting with, including the technology. And here, the preponderance of urban legends, including cars, is actually pretty amazing when you read the rest of Dorson's book, because there are so many different twists on the stories that can happen in the context of new cars or automobiles. And in another article talking about urban legends, we talk about the difference between your own folklore, again, the positionality of it, and the stories of others, the stories that you can recognize as obviously fictitious, and the stories that you can recognize as your own. We are not aware of our own folklore any more than we are aware of the grammatic rules of language. When we follow the ancient practice of informally transmitting quote unquote lore, wisdom, knowledge, or accepted modes of behavior by word of mouth and customary example from person to person, we do not concentrate on the form or content of our folklore. Instead, we simply listen to information that others tell us and then pass it on, more or less accurately, to other listeners. In this stream of unself-conscious oral tradition, the information that acquires a clear storyline is called narrative folklore, and those stories alleged to be true are legends. This, in broad summary, is the typical process of legend formation and transmission as it has existed from time immemorial and continues to operate today. It works about the same way whether the legendary plot concerns a dragon in a cave or a mouse in a Coke bottle. So the transformation of a story of folklore until the legend is the truth aspect. Again, the local truth, as I've mentioned before. And of course, this is the story that is told probably from a more or less reliable sources, which is important in this case because if you get separated physically, emotionally, geographically from the meaning of the story itself, then it just becomes a fun story. It could become a fairy tale. And again, in fact, the Grimm fairy tales are so distant to us that we can barely recognize them as legends. Although they might have been legend at some point, they have lost those legendary aspects. Brunvand here in this book is considering the symbolic meaning of the stories as well, which is important because the story is being passed on unconsciously almost, as he points out here, kind of the grammatical rules of language. So not necessarily thinking the idea through, but passing on what seems to be the most important part. So there is some basic structure to it. There are some basic features that will appear. So an opposition between good and bad, between life and death, etc. But more importantly, those recognizable elements will be turned into more meaningful elements once they enter the domain of the narrative story. And certainly it is easy to see how the meaning of a legend will shift over the years once the symbols will more or less acquire meaning or more or less lose their meaning. So talking about luck, for example, and what luck means and whether or not luck can be manifested in one way or another, or whether or not chance or happenstance can be forced in some way, are part of the larger story that is told in legend. And if people are willing to believe that they can make their own luck, then they enter the realm of a legend. Besides the stories that could be told of people making their own luck, of course. And in the context of cars, this is especially interesting to see how quickly the stories can move around. For example, in this record from 1890 of a story of people told in pre-Soviet Russia. There is a story going on about town that is worthy of attention. The only question is whether it is true and to what extent. The other day, somewhere on Sergeyevskaya Street, or near it, a priest carrying the holy sacraments came to a certain apartment after Mass. A young man answered the door. I was asked to come here and give the sacraments to a sick man, said the priest. You must have made a mistake. Nobody lives here except me. No, a lady came up to me today and gave me this address and asked me to give the sacraments to the man who lives here. The young apartment dweller was perplexed. Why, look, that is the very woman who asked me to come, said the priest, pointing to a woman's portrait hanging on the wall. That is the portrait of my dead mother. Awe, fear, terror seized hold of the young man. Under the impression of all this, he took communion. That evening, he lay dead. Such is the story. So, pretty brief story, a pretty brief legend of a sort, but something that has some recognizable elements. For example, here, a painting of a deceased person, and that deceased person crossing into our world to ask for sacraments from a priest. So there are some very easily connectable elements. There are a little bit more confusing elements to us, generally speaking, but we are still within the domain of crossing from the fact to the fiction, and the fact that this person exists, but their spirit crossed into our world, appeared in the form of a ghost to a priest who typically probably should not be worried about ghosts. And intervening in our real world is something that turns the story into the legend uh, of a person and their connection to the world that we are living in. And there are several versions of this story that are passed on all the way across the time from pre-Soviet Russia to the modern day and in many other societies, as Jertin points out. again, 1968, one may well wonder whether anything like this has ever happened before or since in all of folklore history. Consider the facts. An urban legend, hitherto unknown, suddenly sweeps through 900,000 inhabitants of the Russian capital, creating such an uproar that within the space of 3 weeks, at least three variants of the tale are recorded in four of the city's newspaper and very possibly others as well, which have not yet discovered. And then no further trace of the tale is to be found until a variant is recorded more than half a century later in London. A further peculiarity lies in the treatment of this tale by the Petersburg newspaper. Only one of them confined itself to telling the story without comment. The other two treated it as an occasion for commenting on various shortcomings of Russian society. So we are connecting here a bunch of threads from the moral of the story to the spread of the story from, again, this narrative story being passed on as folklore and eventually turning into what we today will call an urban legend in a space that is quickly urbanizing, that is turn of the century Russia. Urban legends in this context are a little bit different from your garden variety legend, partly because they happen in a contemporary setting and because that is the most recognizable part of our lives, and they might happen in this daily world as opposed to Cappadocia, where there's dragons. They are also based in word of mouth, and this is something that we're going to carry along in the next few weeks as we realize that the stories, once they are told, get to take a life of their own, a little bit separate from the structure itself, although structure has a role to play in this. Urban legends also carry a moral element because you are supposed to learn something from it, and those newspapers in Russia seeing how the legend says something about the changing conditions that they're living on is important as well. And in this context, it is not necessarily important that the story follows a specific line, but it is important that you are learning the right the right moral from it. So it may change pretty drastically in shape, not just in the details, but also in the broader outline, as long as you know or you learn that things are happening to other people out there. And this is probably the biggest change from a lot of the conversations we have had so far, is that aspects of folklore and aspects of legends are typically seen as something that is very different from quote unquote us, and sometimes associated with something that is called primitive, as we have talked about before in this class. But it turns out once we have the very identifiable form of the urban legend, that this is something that could happen to anyone and certainly happens to everyone who is put in one of those situations of telling a story and repeating it without fully fact checking it.